Very quick video on when penguins are more important than people. It's the landings at San Carlos Bay in the Falklands. That's sort of in the Falkland Sound between West and East Falkland, night of 21st of May, 1982. Continued obviously for several days while he landed more people and more equipment and stuff. But I was just listening to a rather hilarious interview actually, where the Navy commander and the Army commander, who were responsible for the troops on the land and getting them in when it's the Navy, and they were discussing the different points where they potentially could land. They wanted to land where there was no fire or very light enemy resistance, so the beach landings wouldn't be contested because they didn't have enough men to storm ashore at Stanley or something. So they wanted to get their men in and then get them into action on their terms with everything they needed. But what's rather amusing is that they had what they were describing as a very useful person on board, who was someone called Huey Sotheby Taylor, who, before the Falklands conflict, had sailed all around the Falklands, and he'd written a book about it, apparently, all the different little bays and inlets and things, and he described the flora and the fauna and the sea conditions, and he was there on board as a specialist. I imagine this was serendipitous that he was there, so they got him. And he was their special advisor on the landings. Anyhow, one of the places they said looked absolutely perfect for landing was at some point. Was it King's Point? I'm not sure of the name. But either way, it seemed perfect. And it's funny when you hear in this later interview that Navy and Army commanders whose names I don't know which ones. It wasn't Sandy Woodward, the land commander. It might have been Julian Thompson. Not sure. But either way, they're interviewing later in life, and they're like, not sure why we didn't land there. And Navy's kind of, I think there may have been a big swell there, so we didn't want to risk that. When Ewan went there, there was a big swell. Then they cut to an interview with this Ewan Sotheby Taylor bloke. And he said, actually, no, at that point, it was perfect, but it was home to the only colony of king penguins on the Falklands. And I knew with all of these men and machines and bombs and everything, if we landed there, the penguins would go, and that would be the end of the penguins. So I invented some reasons why we couldn't land there. And so in the end, they go for San Carlos Bay, which the topography wasn't great because it meant that the Sea Cat missiles, the sort of shorter range ones that can take out a jet when it's fairly near you, or even a missile, they couldn't lock on to their targets because of the land topography. And obviously it became known as Bomb Alley, that particular place, because several ships were sunk. And of course, yet another example of the BBC doing what it does best, which is messing things up for everybody, English. And it was around this time that they put out reports saying, these stupid Argentinians, they're not fusing their bombs correctly. Because, of course, the bombs they were using had actually been sold to them by the British previously. And they had retarded fuses, or retarding fuses, meaning when you fly over them in a fast jet at 400 knots or whatever, the problem is that the bomb and the plane will explode the bomb will explode simultaneously to the plane being above, therefore the plane will explode. So you have to have a fuse that has a delay in it, so it blows up a little bit later after the jet is away safely. But you have to rise up to a certain height so the fuse has time to engage. And they were actually skimming in so low at 0 feet and then dropping these large, I think they're 1,000 kilogram bombs, this kind of thing. Big bombs under these super entente, primarily. Also Mirages, I think, were being used, but super entente mainly. You can see pictures of them flying in with these ginormous bombs, or one bomb strapped beneath the centre fuselage. And this was the thing, that they were coming in so low, rising up just a little bit, dropping their bombs, and the bomb would go through the whole ship if it had managed to do what you try and do, which is turn yourself perpendicular to the aerial attack. So you sideways on, so the bomb can go straight through you rather than lengthways. They were going straight through, or they were coming in and lodging but they hadn't risen up high enough so that the bomb had enough time in flight for, I suppose it has a kind of windmilling sort of priming unit on the fuse. They weren't rising up high enough for that to have enough time to actually start the timer for the retarding fuse. And of course, the BBC put out the report saying this was happening. And after that, the Argentinians, I don't know if they changed the height of their attacks or whether they changed their fuses. I don't quite know the manipulation they did, but they had more success after that. But we won't go into all of it now. We know that second battalion of the parachute regiment, 2 Para under H. Jones, taking position up in the hills just above there, and they, as many of the troops were taking position all around the San Carlos Bay to protect it. Apparently, some of them, these planes were coming so low that the pilots were waving to the troops, but they weren't actually attacking the troops because they had the ships to go for. Interesting, by this point, once all the troops were disembarked from these cruise ships, so I was listening to one veteran about the Canberra, the cruise ship, the Canberra, which had sailed down there. So the Marines are on that one. We're living in relative luxury. Well, one of the problems was they had to keep fit while they made that long voyage down to the South Atlantic. And so apparently a circumference of the deck was about a quarter of a mile. And so you'd have to run around it several times, like to do the maths. I mean, they were wanting to do about at least 4 miles running a day. But as the ship was rolling in the big swells of the mid and the South Atlantic, you get to this point where you're jogging along and then suddenly the ship disappears beneath you, so it feels like you're weightless, and then the ship comes back up. And this was a terrible problem for people's knees. And there were some troops who were going onshore with, snapped cruciate knee ligaments or twisted, patella knee ligaments or, various tendons and things that had been pulled just by this, because the swells were so big, it's about meters of distance. And you can imagine, if you miss time, just, when you're playing football, if there's an unexpected divot or something and you miss time when your knee bends, you hear that crunch and that snap, and you're stuffed, aren't you? And so this was a problem, just getting down there. But one of the interesting things, this is the veteran saying this was not me. I'm not getting involved in any of this stuff. But just to say, he was having a laugh because they actually asked the Canberra civilian crew, who was used to taking people on cruises, so Caribbean and stuff, where they're sipping their Bacardas and Cokes. They actually told them that they are responsible for the safety of the ship now. Now, by and large, the troop transports and the landing craft weren't particularly put under attack because they were much closer in. And the way they'd arranged it was that the fighting ships were further out and they acted like a picket line and a distraction almost to the pilots. So the pilots would attack the fighting ships rather than the troop ships. So it was a decision that had been deliberately made to make sure, or do their best, to attract attention from the Argentinian Air Force. And so the troop ships were not being attacked because the fighting ships were taking the brunt of it and they were further out at the mouth of the bay. But anyway, the troop ships still had general purpose machine guns and things like that mounted on them for some close-in weapon support. I'm sure they weren't enough or anything like that, but they were there. And so they had to get these civilian crews, which, according to this one veteran, even included women who had been working in some kind of nail salon. Well, he tried it as a boutique, so I'm not entirely sure what a boutique is. But there were young girls working in there, and they were helping, with all of this. According to him, I've not heard anyone else say that. They might have disembarked them at St. Island, I don't know. But anyway, what stuck in his mind, he found it quite funny, is that there were 2 camp sounding stewards that were a male couple. And he called them Peter and Paul, but I think those were pseudonyms. And they asked, and they're very, I'm not going to imitate it because I'm mocking people for, but yeah, they sort of asked in their camp way, how can we help out with all of this? And he's like, well, you can man a GPMG. And like, ooh, how do we do that? And yeah, he took these guys up who, civilian crewmen, and showed them how to load a machine gun belt onto it, and, how to prime it and how to fire it. And, this was the level of improvisation, which is something that I guess Britain has always had a knack for, improvising in times of need. But anyway, this has gone on longer than I intended. It really was just to talk about that this Ewan Sotheby Taylor, he's got a weird spelling of his name's obviously very posh, how he saved the king penguin colony of the Falklands while sending the troops in at a less desirable landing spot. Oh, and also it's interesting about the compromise. It's a joke almost that whenever there's conflict between, ground or navy or air, you always reach a compromise. The compromise is never what you want, but that's what you always do anyway. And the navy wanted to go into Falkland Sound in the night, at the start of the night, when it's getting dark. So they had the whole night to make this dangerous passage. The army wanted it, so they go in much later, and so they could disembark when it was dark, but then they'd have light afterwards, so they can all find their positions and offload their equipment. And so they compromised and sort of did it in the middle of the night. And the other thing here was mine sweeping. There were no minesweepers down there, so they had to get either a frigate or a destroyer to just sail up and down the Sound several times, in the hope that if there are mines, well, it'll hit them, and then we know it's mined. And yeah, quite a scary thing. Luckily, the Argentinians didn't have any naval mines, or that would have been a serious blow. To the force that was retaking the Falklands. It's interesting. They asked the veterans who've seen their mates, die, took heavy casualties in particularly Mount London, certainly Goose Green. It was, the commander, or the second in command after Ace Jones was killed, Two Power. He's described it as gutter fighting, because they're fighting at times with fixed bayonets. And it was about, which man's fastest on the trigger, which man is more aggressive. It was, it was a brutal conflict, brutal struggle. But they were asked this question, was it worth it? And to a man, I saw like a meeting of about 5 or 6 of these veterans, all describing their experiences, how terrible it was, and how so many have PTSD and are suffering with all kinds of mental problems after what they'd seen. But they were all asked this question, was it worth it? And the way one of them best described it was when he went up and knocked on a door. I can't remember where it was now, but presumably somewhere far in London, the Falklands. And he knocked on the door, and the lady there was obviously frightened and called out, "Who is it?" And he said, "We're Royal Marines, ma'am, nothing to worry about." And apparently she answered the door, and just the way she welcomed them, and then just burst into tears and, welcomed them in, and that relief that she had of salvation coming. And she's like, "How did you get here?" And he said, well, we jumped 50 miles from San Carlos. It's amazing, walking across those boggy moorlands, blizzards and sleets and all this, all the case of trench foot, for example. This is one thing, actually, interestingly, just a little digression. The Marines, at least the veteran I was listening to, it was a big thing about them, foot care, how to make sure that your feet stay in good condition when they're potentially wet. And it was a big deal to them. If you, like one of them, for example, got out the landing craft, and it was deeper than they thought it was, and so he got really wet. And the first thing they did when they got to shore, they weren't just immediately rushing into battle and take their positions. They made sure this dude, had dry shoes to put on, dry socks, dry trousers. It was a big deal to them that their feet were cared for. I suppose it's a marine thing when you're, used or trained to make assault landings, on beaches and stuff. And they were all almost mocking the paras because so many of them got trench foot. And he sort of told about a story when he went to one of these veterans hubs down in the Isle of Wight, and he's like, I recognise that dude there. The dude's like, yeah, I recognise you, and he's like, the Marine goes, did you have trench foot? And the man's like, yeah, how do you know? And he said, I wanted to say, because you all had trench foot. But he didn't. It turned out he'd lent his boots to, or given a pair of these nuclear, biological, chemical boots that were waterproof to his mate in the Paras, or a man in the Paras that was the mate of the veteran just discussing. And that's how he knew him. He recognised him because even though he didn't speak to him, he'd given these waterproof boots to the dude that was his mate, and all this. But it was interesting, the whole banter about trench foot and struggling with wet feet. Quite a thing you don't think about, but can you imagine, marching all these miles across this awful terrain if you've got trench foot? And of course, these people were so brave and, more than anything, loyalty to their men and their friends, which is, what always is the glue in any unit. Even when they had feet that were swollen up, well, they're saying twice the size. I don't think they could get a pair of boots on if their feet were twice the size, but clearly very swollen with trench foot. Trying to still keep tabbing on if they're a para, yumping on if they're a Marine. But I'd say the Marines took care of their feet, so they didn't have that problem. It's a massive digression. It was really about the penguins. Thanks for listening.